This bonus episode contains descriptions of real violence and historical events that may be disturbing to some listeners. Listener discretion is advised. I'm Becca, and this is Deadly Truths, Dead City, where we step into America's most dangerous neighborhoods at the moment they were still becoming what we now call history. This isn't nostalgia, this isn't myth, it's the raw version, the streets before the postcards, the power before it wore a suit, the people who shaped a city, and the ones who paid for it. Tonight, we're going back to a place where survival had a price and respect was enforced in blood. This is Dead City. If you want to understand the Whyos, you don't start with rumors about price lists. You start in a saloon. It's April 1887. Lower Manhattan, the kind of place where the floor is sticky and arguments last longer than the drinks. John Jake McCarthy runs the place. He's not innocent. No one running a saloon in that neighborhood is. He knows who drinks there. He knows who collects protection. And that's the problem. There's tension brewing between McCarthy and men tied to the Whyos. Money, disrespect, territory. It's never just one thing. That night, Piker Ryan walks in. He isn't alone. There's no dramatic speech, no theatrical buildup. This isn't a movie. It escalates the way these things always escalate, with words that cut too close. Then steel flashes. Ryan stabs McCarthy. Not once, again, and again. It's fast, close, personal. McCarthy collapses in his own establishment, bleeding out on the floor he's stood behind for years. There's no mystery about who did it. Witnesses saw it. The neighborhood knew it. The Whyos had operated for years on intimidation and reputation, but this time the city decided to make an example. Ryan was arrested, then tried and convicted, and in 1888, he was executed by hanging. It was public. That's the part that matters because the Whyos were used to delivering violence. However, they weren't used to being the spectacle because the city could tolerate corruption and it could tolerate quiet deals, but it could no longer tolerate open butchery in saloons where working families lived upstairs. And that's the lesson the next generation absorbed. Don't stab a man where everyone can see it. You need to control the room before the knife ever comes out. If any of us would have walked through 5 Points in the 1870s, we wouldn't have needed a newspaper to tell you who ran it. You would have felt it. The Whyos weren't subtle. They weren't trying to look respectable. They didn't operate behind polished club doors. They were the kind of men who made sure you knew they were there. They controlled corners, saloons, dance halls. If someone owed money, if someone insulted the wrong person, if a political operative needed a message delivered, you hired a Whyos man. There was even talk that they kept a rate card for violence, a set price for a beating, more for broken bones, the most for a killing. Whether the newspapers exaggerated it or not, the reputation stuck. They were known as men you could contract for pain, and the men leading them weren't masterminds. They were products of overcrowded tenements and street hierarchies that rewarded humiliation as much as strength. Take Dandy Johnny Dolan. He wasn't physically imposing, which almost made him worse. He dressed sharply, almost flamboyantly for the time, and carried himself like someone who enjoyed attention. He had a reputation for being vicious in fights, not just stabbing, but biting, taunting, prolonging it. Violence wasn't just business for him, it was theater. Then there was Piker Ryan, more calculating, less showy. He understood organization, but not restraint. When he was convicted of murder and executed in 1888, it marked something significant. The city was done tolerating open-air brutality. Public hangings weren't just punishment. They were a statement that the era of visible street butchery was becoming a liability. The Whyos thrived on visibility. They wanted to be feared, they leaned into it, and that culture shaped everyone around them. Women in their orbit lived inside that volatility. Wives and girlfriends hid weapons, carried messages, sat in courtrooms to testify to their good character. Young Irish women moved through the same dance halls where Whyos men gathered, and proximity to that kind of power could mean protection or exposure. If you were attached to a Whyos man, you inherited his enemies. This wasn't organized crime as we think of it later. It wasn't boardrooms and silk suits. It was reactive, emotional, territorial. Respect was enforced physically, immediately, and often publicly, and that was the problem. The Whyos burned hot and burned out. Leaders jailed, executed, shot. Internal fractures, increased police pressure. By the late 1880s, they were fading. But they left something behind. They proved that neighborhoods could be controlled, that violence could be monetized, that political machines would quietly use men like them when convenient. The next generation saw that. By the time the Whyos appear in New York in the 1870s, 5 Points is already layered with gang history. The Dead Rabbits, the Bowery Boys, turf wars that go back decades. The Whyos weren't the first, but they were what came after. They were mostly young Irish-American men who grew up in the tenements of Lower Manhattan, sons of immigrants who arrived with nothing and found themselves packed into neighborhoods where opportunity was scarce and reputation meant survival. Street identity wasn't optional there because it afforded protection. The Whyos formed out of earlier Irish street factions that splintered and reassembled. They weren't born from ideology or politics. They were born from proximity. Same blocks, same saloons, same grudges. They became known for something very specific. They would do violence for hire. Now the name, Whyos. There's debate about its origin. One explanation is that it came from the gang's taunting call, a drawn-out Whyo shout they would use to signal each other in the streets. Another theory suggests it was derived from a corruption of Whyo, or Irish slang, that newspapers mangled over time. The truth is, most of what we know about the Whyos comes filtered through sensationalist press coverage. And the press loved colorful names. What's clear is that by the 1880s, Whyos meant something very specific in New York: hired street violence. If you grow up in 5 Points in the 1870s, you grow up inside pressure. Most of the young Irish men who joined the Whyos were sons of immigrants who had already absorbed years of discrimination. They watched their parents be mocked, underpaid, and treated as temporary outsiders in a place that depended on their labor. When you grow up seeing your father swallow insults because he needs the job, something forms inside you. You either learn to endure humiliation quietly, or you decide you never will. In neighborhoods like that, respect becomes a form of security. It isn't about ego, it's about safety. If people think you're weak, they test you. If they test you and you don't respond, it spreads. Reputation is currency, and it circulates fast. The Whyos offered a way to build that currency quickly. They also offered belonging. In a tenement district where institutions feel distant and formal systems feel stacked against you, a gang provides structure. There are rules. There are loyalties. There is a name that carries weight. Being a Whyos man meant you were not alone and you were not invisible. Then there is the economic reality. If legal work is scarce or barely sustaining, you monetize what you can. In that environment, physical intimidation becomes a service. If fights break out in saloons every week, if stabbings happen within walking distance of home, the extraordinary becomes ordinary. The first act of violence might feel reactive. The next one feels necessary. Eventually, it becomes part of your identity. You stop thinking of yourself as someone who did something violent and start thinking of yourself as someone who is capable of it. That identity can feel stabilizing in a chaotic world. It offers status in a place where status is otherwise scarce. It offers fear in a city that has made you feel powerless. For young men shaped by poverty, humiliation, and constant competition for space, violence for hire did not feel like random cruelty. It felt like leverage. That is the psychological soil the Whyos grew out of. Gangs like the Whyos don't just happen. They grow out of pressure. Imagine being a young Irish immigrant in Lower Manhattan in the 1870s. Privacy doesn't exist. Stability doesn't exist. You grow up watching your parents work endlessly and still barely survive. Outside your block, you're unwanted. Newspapers mock your accent. Employers pay you less. Signs openly exclude you. Police treat your neighborhood like it's already criminal. That kind of environment shapes identity early. You learn that institutions are not neutral. They don't feel protective. They feel hostile or indifferent. So trust shifts inward, to family, to neighbors, to young men who grew up exactly like you did. Now add adolescence. Adolescent males are wired for hierarchy, for status, for proving themselves. In stable societies, that energy gets redirected into sports, trades, military service, political participation. In 5 points, the legitimate ladders are broken or blocked. So hierarchy builds in the street. Respect becomes survival currency. If you're perceived as weak, you're targeted. If you're humiliated publicly and don't respond, you invite more humiliation. The response has to be visible, physical, memorable. Violence becomes communication, and then comes belonging. Whyos isn't just a label. It's armor. It says you're not alone. It says someone will retaliate if you're crossed. For young men raised in instability, that cohesion feels stabilizing. There's also a shift that happens when violence becomes monetized. Once you realize that your capacity for intimidation can be sold, it stops feeling random. It becomes transactional. You're not just lashing out. You're working, collecting debts, enforcing agreements, protecting turf for pay. In enclaves where the formal justice system feels inaccessible or biased, an informal enforcement system emerges. The Whyos filled that space brutally, inelegantly, but coherently. Psychologically, this creates reinforcement loops. Fear produces reputation. Reputation produces income. Income produces status. Status protects against humiliation. Each act of violence strengthens the identity. Over time, empathy narrows. Not because these men are born without it, but because repeated exposure to brutality normalizes it. When knife fights are weekly occurrences and arrests are routine, shock diminishes. What once felt extreme becomes ordinary, and once violence becomes ordinary, escalation is easier. The Whyos were not masterminds building a dynasty. They were young men responding to structural pressure with the tools available to them. Poverty, discrimination, density, limited upward mobility, constant exposure to aggression. That mix creates volatility. Their psychology was not grand strategy, it was reactive dominance. And that's why they ultimately collapsed. Because reactive dominance burns hot, but it doesn't build insulation. It doesn't adapt when the state decides to intervene. It doesn't survive scrutiny. Young men who discovered that fear was the only currency the city couldn't easily take from them. They turned violence into identity, and identity into income. And for a time, that worked. But they were too visible, too reactive, too addicted to spectacle. Their collapse marks the moment when brute force stopped being enough. The next generation didn't reject what the Whyos did. They refined it. They learned to hide the blood, to bury the spectacle, to build power that didn't swing from a gallows. The Whyos are the raw nerve before the suit jacket goes on. They fell because they never learned to disguise either one. History has a way of cleaning itself up. It turns gangs into legends, violence into folklore, men into caricatures. But cities aren't built on stories. They're built on decisions, on power, on who was protected and who wasn't. The streets we walk today still carry the architecture of those choices. And understanding that doesn't mean romanticizing it. It means seeing it clearly. I'm Becca, and this has been Deadly Truths, Dead City. Because cities don't forget. They just bury what built them.